Good evening, everyone. Today we'll be learning about variables in programming. So, before we begin, I just want to tell you that we will learn a bit about the theoretical side of programming. We will start by understanding what are variables, the characteristics of variables, how to define variables, what is the best practices when defining variables, and the types of variables. Then we will focus on the practical implementation by writing a few lines of code to see how variables work. So, without wasting any time, let's begin. Now, what is a variable? In simple terms, a variable is a named memory location. That is basically a name given to a storage area that a program can manipulate. Now, what I want you to focus on here is the word storage area. One thing we need to remember that is whenever a program runs, some memory is allocated to that program. Now, what is this memory used for? Is basically it is used to store data that a program uses during its execution. Now, this data can be anything from a simple integer value to a name of a person. Now, let's assume that this is the memory allocated to our program when the program begins to run. Now, in this memory, we have different blocks. Now, this is just an overview of what computer memory is. I am not teaching you in detail how does computer memory work. We will learn that in some other topic. Now, let's assume that each block has some name or number associated with it. In this case, let us take numbers. These numbers are called as addresses. So let's say this is block number 0, this is block number 1, this is block number 2, and so on till we have n number of blocks. So n here is basically the size of my memory that was allocated to the program during runtime. Now, when my program runs, like I said, we have allocated memory of size n. And let's say we want to store some data in this memory. Let's say we want to store the value 10 at location or block number 300, that is at the address 300. Now, how can we do that? We will do that by declaring or defining a variable. Now, like I said, a variable means a named memory location, which means that this block will be given some name. So this name can be anything, such as a simple alphabet A. So what am I doing here is that at location 300, which I have given the name A, I am storing the value 10. Now this can be done in the following way. Let me give an example. Int A is equal to 10. This is how I declare a variable. Now let's break this down into parts and understand what does each word do here. Let's start with the first word, which is int. Here int stands for integer, which is basically a data type. Now what does data type mean? See, data type basically defines what kind of data a variable will store. Now in this case we are storing the value 10, which is an integer value. So the data type in this case is an integer. Similarly, there are different data types which we'll learn in the topic ahead, that is integers, floats, which is decimal values, then boolean values, and so on. Then we look at the next term, which is a. A here is the identifier or the name of the variable. Okay, it is the identifier of the name of the variable. That is the name we'll be giving the storage area or the location in memory. And then we have a value. Value is the data which we'll be storing at this location. Okay, so this is how we can declare or define a variable in C programming. Now, before we go into the details of this, let's see a few more characteristics of what variables do and how do they work. Now, coming to the next point, like I said, variables are used to store data that can be referenced and manipulated by a program. Now, what do I mean by referenced and manipulated is that whenever we run a program has to accomplish some certain objectives. And it does this by manipulating or changing data during program execution by performing some kind of operations on the data. And by this, we understand that a variable can change value during program execution. This is a key point to remember, that the value of a variable can change. Another thing to remember is that a variable has a specific data type. So whenever we define the value, let's say integer a, it means that a can only take integer values. That is values such as negative numbers and positive numbers and even the number 0. It cannot take decimal values such as 1.23 and any other decimal values, because that goes against the data type which we have mentioned here. So since we have mentioned integer data type, we will be dealing, a variable can only store integer values. Like I said, data type defines the type of data which will be stored at the memory location. And another thing that the data type does, it determines the size of the variable or the size of the data that the variable can store. And it can also mention the range of values that can be stored at that memory location. Now, what do I mean by size is we'll be seeing that in another lecture, but a data type specifies the size based on the compiler or the type of operating system, type of system we are using. Okay, in a 64-bit system, data types have different sizes. Similarly, in a 32-bit system, the data type will have different sizes. So we'll be seeing that in another lecture, not today. Let's continue with variables. Now, let's talk about the few characteristics of variables, which we should remember always. First thing is that a variable has a name. So like I showed you, in this case, we have given the variable name A. Similarly, we can give it any other name, or like whatever we like. Let's say we want to give the name int number 1 is equal to 10. So this number 1 takes the value 10. So number 1 is basically the name of the variable here. So I can give my variable any name I like. But there are some rules and restrictions that need to be followed when naming variables, which we will see a bit ahead. Now, second thing comes the type. Every variable should have some type, that is the type of kind of data it can store. Like I mentioned, it can be an integer value, a float value, or a boolean value, that is true or false. Next thing is that a variable has a value. Now, whenever we define a variable, we can give the variable some value. In this case, like we give the value 10. In some cases, when we don't give the variable a value, it can either take a garbage value. A garbage value is basically just any arbitrary value that it picks up on its own, or it can take a default value of 0. And we will see how it does that when we learn about what are local variables and global variables. Now, the next thing we need to know is every variable has a scope. Scope means that where in the code we can access that variable. Now, I will give you an example on this a bit ahead. So for now, let's skip this and we will see the best practices and restrictions to be followed when naming variables. We will come to scope and resolution just in a while. Okay, no, I mean scope and lifetime just in some time. So let's see the best practices. Before that, we will have a look at the syntax. So the basic syntax for defining a variable is as follows. The first thing you have to do is mention the data type. Okay, we mention the data type. Then what we will do is we will mention the identifier. Identifier means the name of the variable. Let me give a simple example. So the example here is, I'll just open my Visual Studio Code and show you how this is done. So I'll give you a simple example here. So let's write a simple C program to print a variable onto the console. So I'll say hashtag. I will import the header files and libraries. Int main. Now let's define a variable here. Let's say int. Your int is the data type. Okay, so we are following the syntax which I'm showing you here. First comes the data type, and then comes the identifier, that is the name of the variable. So int a. Now I haven't assigned a value to this variable, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's say a is equal to 10. Now let's print this value onto the console. So I'll say printf %d. This %d is basically a format specifier, which we learn about in the next lecture, what are format specifiers, and we will print the value a. Let's go ahead and compile this. Now let's run this program. So as you can see, it has print the value 10 here. So this is how we can define and declare a variable. Now let's go back and see some best practices we should follow when defining variables. Now remember one thing, whenever we are defining a variable, the first character must always be a letter. Never start your variable with a number, as this is a bad practice. The underscore symbol also counts as a letter, and it is useful for improving the readability of long variable names. So I can say num underscore number 1, underscore number 2. But remember one thing, let's whenever you're programming, try not to begin variable names with underscore. Now the reason for this is that some libraries in C mostly use the underscore to name their variables. So try to avoid using underscore, although it's not a bad practice, but try to keep your variable name simple. One key point to remember here is that uppercase and lowercase are distinct. I'll give an example of this. So let's say I define the variable a here, and I'll also define another variable capital A. Okay. Now let's give uppercase a value of 12. Now this a and this a have different meanings. So if I print them, we will get different values. So similarly, I will compile my code and run it. As you can see, the these a have different values. Okay, so lowercase a and uppercase a have different meanings. So make sure to keep this in mind. Also remember one thing, in C, it is a good practice to use lowercase for variable names and uppercase for symbolic constants. Now what are constants? We will be having a separate video on constants and how to define constants. And another rule to remember is that we cannot use keywords like if, else, int, float, etc. because these keywords are reserved. So we cannot name a variable as these keywords. So always be cautious not to name your variable using these keywords. I will give you a list of all keywords in C that are reserved, and you shouldn't use them as variables name. And remember, the last point to remember is that whenever declaring a variable, choose a name that is relatable to the purpose of the variable. For example, let's say I am uh, I am I want to give my variable a name of a car. Okay, so let's say I'll declare a variable that is a string value, and I'll say car is equal to Volvo. Okay, Volvo. So here basically I have defined a character array, which is basically how we represent strings in C. Unlike Python and other programming languages, in C a string is basically a character array. So as you can see here, I have given my variable the name car and the value Volvo. So this becomes easier for a programmer to go through the program and see what does a variable do and what is the purpose of that variable. So always try to keep your variable names related to the purpose of that variable. Now let's come to the next topic, that is the types of variables. Now when it comes to programming, variables are based on their scope. They are classified according to their scope into two types. One is local variables and global variables. Now let's begin with the first scope, that is of local variables. So local variables are basically variables that are defined inside a function or a block. Now what is a function? That too we'll be seeing later, because there are a lot of fundamentals we need to cover before everything binds together and makes a meaning. So scope. Let's start with the scope of local variables. So local variables are basically variables that are defined inside a function or a block and are accessible only within that function or a block. Now let's take an example here. So what do I mean by local variable is, let's say I take a variable, I'll define a function here that will print the age of a person. Now this function will print the age of a person. Let's say int age is equal to 30. So as you can see, I've defined the variable age here and I've given age as 30. Now what I will do is, let's print the age. Okay, if I print the age, %d slash n, and I will print the age. Now what happens is that whenever I call this function, it will print the value 30. So let's try this out. Print age. Okay, this will print the value 30 and we will return value 0. Now let's compile and run this program. Now when I run this program, you can see it print the age as 30. Now what happens if I try to access this variable from outside the function? So let's try to do that. Let's try to print the value of a outside this function which I have defined. So let's say printf age %d, that is the format specifier to print integer values, and I will print the age of the person. Now as you can see here, my compiler will throw an error saying that age is undefined. So what does this mean? This means that this variable which I defined here, it can only be accessed inside this function, and this is called as a local variable. And remember one thing, local variables have their scope limited to the function or the block of code in which they are defined. In other words, I can only access this variable inside this function. Understood? Now there is a way to also do it, to access the variable in another function, and that we will see in when we cover the topic of pointers in C. For now, just need to remember that this variable can only be accessed inside this function. That is, the scope of this variable is inside the printage function. So this is the characteristics of local variables. Okay, and one more thing we need to remember is that the lifetime of a local variable. Now the lifetime of a local variable means that, what do we mean by lifetime is that how long or is the variable accessible. Okay, so the lifetime of this variable only lasts for the duration of the function or the block. Now once the function is called, this way the memory which was allocated for the variable is released. So what I mean here is that when I define the variable a inside the function, and after calling the function, what will happen is that this value will be removed from memory, but the program will continue to execute. Now when we come to global variables, the case here is the opposite of that of local variables. In global variables, what happens is that we define global variables outside the function, outside any function, and it can be accessed by any program in the function. So let's take an example here. Now in the same program, I'll just make a small change. I will define another variable int age equal to 40. Now you can see here I defined age as 40 here and age as 30 in this function. Now as you can see here, this variable which I have defined here, it is outside to all functions. It doesn't belong to any function. So what happens is that now you can see my error has vanished. Now let's see what happens when I try to print the value here of age. So let's go ahead and try to print this. Now I will compile my program and I will run it. And as you can see, it print the value 40. So what does this mean? So it means that my main program is accessing this value, that is the global variable which I have defined here, and not the value which is inside this function. Since this is a local variable, it can only be accessed inside this function, and since this is a global variable, it can only be accessed, it can be accessed by all functions outside, all functions of the program. So I'll just put a comment here. This is a global variable and this here is a local variable. Now what about the lifetime of this global variable? For how long it can be accessed? Now when it comes to global variables, the lifetime of global variables, it lasts for the entire duration of the program. That is from the point it was declared till the program terminates. So until my program or my thread terminates, this variable can be accessed in the entire program. Whereas in the case of local variables, it can only be accessed as long as the function is called and the function exits. Now, this is the key difference between local and global variables. So I hope you like this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one where we'll be learning about what are functions and data types. So if you want to access my notes or you like the notes which I have written here, you can message in the comment box and I will send you a link to download them. Thank you and see you in the next lecture.